Okay, everyone, welcome. Thank you for being here. My name is Matilde Guidelli. I'm a curator and curatorial department head here at DIA, and I am beyond honored to introduce today's conversation between Michael Brenson and the great Melvin Edwards on the occasion of the closing of Melvin's beautiful exhibition of barbed wire sculptures that has been on view since 2022. Before diving in with the introduction, and a few thank yous are due to Kim Golding, Dan Wolf, Liv Kuniberti, and the visitor service team at DIA, as well as Alex Gray and Paige Bankowski at Alexander Gray Gallery, and to our former colleagues, Alexis Lowry and Zuna Maza, who worked closely with Melvin on his presentation here at DIA, and most especially, of course, our gratitude goes to Melvin and Michael for accepting our invitation. Michael Brenson is a curator, writer, and was for 20 years professor of sculpture at Bard, and currently serves as the artistic director of the Jonathan and Barbara Silver Foundation. Michael and Melvin have been in continued conversation for years now, both informally, they are neighbors, and formally in 1993, on the occasion of Melvin's first career survey at Neuberger Museum of Art, Michael wrote an establishing essay on Melvin's Lynch Fragment series. And more recently, in 2014, Michael conducted the essential oral history interview with Melvin for Bomb. And if you have not had a chance to read it, I truly recommend it, maybe even on the way back on the train. Melvin Edwards was born in Houston's Fifth Ward in 1937. As a young person, he moved with his family to Ohio and then back to Houston, and then in 1955 to Los Angeles for college, where he played football and studied art. From about 1963 on, alongside teaching, he would devote his time almost exclusively to welding the innovative sculptures that made up his first exhibitions in Los Angeles. These included, and we'll see them during the conversation, diagrammatic three-dimensional constructions held by chains, and the frontal works that are collectively titled Lynch Fragments. Melvin moved to New York in '67, and by the end of the decade, he began receiving public commissions for outdoor sculptures, and his barbed wire sculptures were presented at the Studio Museum and at the Whitney in '69 and 1970, and the material continues to be part of his vocabulary alongside chains and welded forms. It is also in the late '60s that Melvin started traveling to Cuba and Africa with frequency, with each place marking his experience and vice versa, realizing permanent works there. The importance of an artist is first and foremost, I think, measured by the influence on their peers. And over the years, we've been having the pleasure to host Melvin sculptures here at Beacon. Many artists have shared their reverence and admiration for his work. Tiona Nekia McLauden, who delivered an extraordinary artist lecture on Melvin this past fall, called him a para-mentor to express the role that he has had in her life, career, and work, even if indirectly. And Sengan Ngudi, whose work is in the galleries here, and who, like Melvin, started to make art in Los Angeles in the 1960s, remember seeing Melvin's first solo show at the Santa Barbara Museum of Art in '65, and feeling encouraged that everything was possible, she said, everything being to her sculpture that is abstract, but that still involved the life that she had been living and exposed to, rather than being limited to formalist kind of criticism that was functional in the art world at the time. And so, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Michael Brenson and Melvin Edwards.
Thank you, Matilda. This is working, right? I'm delighted to be here with Mel. I learned so much from this guy and from his work, really more than I can put into words. And he and I met 40 years ago. I started to first work I saw of yours was in Tradition and Conflict show at the Studio Museum in 1985. It's where I saw the Lynch Fragments. And I was, completely taken in by them and followed them everywhere and kind of followed you everywhere. And we met a year later, and we've had a conversation that's been ongoing for 40 years now, sometimes broken by months or years, but I feel always a real continuity to it. And it's been conversations and it's been formal interviews and a combination of the conversations and formal interviews. And so here we are in Dia, this great place, and a chance for a new version of it. And I do want to thank Dia too, and also indicate my appreciation for the installation that you've done with Mel. I'm really aware of the kinds of projects that can change an artist's life or a writer's life, where you do it and you give them a chance to do it, and then the work is in a different place. and the perception of the work is in a different place, and I feel that's what you've done with Mel. Like a lot of people knew the barbed wire works. I knew of them. They're referred to very often in the literature, but I couldn't have imagined this installation, and I do want to spend a good deal of time talking with Mel about them. I think it's important to do so on the record because they're coming down, unfortunately, or they've had a 4-year run, and they're also unreproducible. So at least I haven't seen any reproductions of them that begin to give any kind of sense of what the work is actually like. So he and I will talk about that. We'll see where it goes, and then at a certain point, we'll open it up to you all, because I'm sure you'll have questions and responses that will be welcome. I feel like I can talk for a long time about Mel, and Matilde gave some idea of how remarkable his life has been. It's a remarkable life, and to start off in the Fifth Ward in Houston, the segregated Houston, and Dayton, Ohio, and back to Houston, and then to LA for college and art school, and playing football at USC, and beginning to show there, and the beginning of the Lynch Fragments there, and then to New York, and then back to LA, and then back to New York, and then beginning in 1970, the extraordinary a journey and time that he spent in Africa, which became a huge part of his life then. And I think he said at a certain point I go there every chance I get, and I go there more often than I do to Houston and Nigeria and Ghana and Zimbabwe, and then getting a home with Jane in Senegal in 2000. So it became one of his homes. And then in 1981, through Ana Mendieta, going to Cuba, and then Cuba becoming a big part of his life. And it's not just going to these places, it's people he met there. I mean, he met and was in contact with some of the most remarkable people in the world over the last 75 years. So Cuba became a big part of his life, and then he went to Brazil as well. And I think it's important to say, not just going to these places and meeting people, but he made work there. And it was important for him to make work there. This is a whole other exhibition. There are many Mel Edwards shows to do, and that would be one of them, to try to bring the work together from these different places and see what they would look like. But he made a point of working with craftsmen and artisans everywhere and really learning something fundamental about the various cultures. So it's a hell of a journey. It's a peripatetic life. There's a tremendous amount of movement in it. There's still movement in it, because Mel still lives in different places, and it's remarkable, and a remarkable journey. I don't know anything quite like it. Okay, so Mel, I'd like us to talk about these barbed wire works in Dia, and maybe and talk about how this work came about, and compare it a little bit to the previous versions of it, because I do know that you made these works in 1969 and 1970. that they were shown at the Whitney and the lobby gallery. That but there was kind of curtailed, like there was an idea that was really important to you that you wanted to have a chance to develop more, and you never really got a chance to. And then Dia came along, and they offered you these galleries, and they were interested in the work, and they said, you know, sort of go for it. So a lot of these ideas that you have been living with for a long time had a chance to be developed, and they emerged, and it seems to me that they emerged in quite a different and quite a stunning way. So, okay, the first question, I guess, is to ask you how this project came about.
You mean here at Beacon?
At Dia Beacon.
Somebody called me, I don't remember who. I'm not, my first visit to Beacon, if I remember right, had to do with Sam Gilliam. But I knew of it. I really don't remember what the first time was or that kind of thing. I just know that when we did talk, and having taken a tour of the building spaces, you can do almost anything that I had thought of. One of the things with the works of mine that are apparently related to geometry, I think, go back to my high school years. I did take one class in architecture at Phyllis Wheatley High School. Mr. Thomas was our teacher. His son was a football player with me, but I'm saying it that way because things didn't go in what we call a straight line. They developed, or just ideas and thoughts would come to me and then show up at another time in another form. In other words, you start off learning about art as a figurative, set of dynamics, and you try and do it as well as you can. And then you start finding your way, I'll say intuiting your way through all the names. Nobody would mention Paul Klee in relation to me, but one of the first books I ever sent off to get about an artist was, I think it's even a Prager published book, but by Paul Klee. And what can I say about him? My work doesn't look like his or anything, like that. But I always felt he had a sensitivity to form, space, and ideas by implication, And I don't know, the content part that seems I bump up against and with and use it's a natural part of things, There's no way to have content, and for me, you can't say abstract as if it wasn't related to content or something, whether the content is in advance of the work or during the process or afterwards or maybe all of it, It's, I guess it's like, for me, like musical improvisational composition, And so it's visual art, sculpture, when it's three-dimensional, but it, I would say sculpture has its two-dimensional side. In other words, I tend to look at things the way they are, and as I think everybody more or less understands it, but I always try to find something else in it or juxtapose something else with it. So for instance, in that first exhibition at the Santa Barbara Museum in 1965, which is primarily Lynch fragments and a freestanding works, but one work was suspended, was what we call abstract forms, but suspended by chain and linear hooks. And for me, it was a combination of mass, space, and linearity. In other words, and the linearity was an implication of drawing. Okay. As far as titles and content, sometimes I think when you, it's like having a baby. You do what you do to, and somebody says they're pregnant, you know, and, and you weren't planning on a baby, and then now you gotta, all the things that come with it, and those things you gotta name it, you gotta feed it, take care of it, and help it grow and become something tangible. But in that earliest period, it's improvisation, and when there's an argument of abstraction or discussion, I tend to say, well, most of us use the word, but most of us have never looked it up in a dictionary. I hadn't, but I had a sense of what it was. And then I said, well, why don't I relate it to something else in language, like the term extract, abstract, extract. And that seemed to fit for me with my earliest learnings of how one might develop from figurative art to abstract in appearance art.
Can I ask you that is this still on? Is this good? Okay. So you were given these galleries, right?
Mm-hmm.
These were the galleries you had to work with. And you talk about walking through Dia, and you mentioned Sam Gilliam.
Mm-hmm.
I know that you know other people here.
Chamberlain was the other one.
That you knew Chamberlain as well, because it seems to me that in this work you could also be speaking to other artists. People have mentioned Fred Sandback and
Mm-hmm.
and Bruce Nauman and Richard Serra. That there's a whole kind of family of art, the Dia, that is part of Dia, that could also be that you could relate to as who you are as an artist, as an abstract artist, as someone who works with line and geometry. And so if I talk about how this work took form, you were given the galleries, you walked in, and then you had some idea immediately that these were the pieces you wanted to put in, and those works were somewhere, inevitably informed to some degree by the nature of the place.
They were, but the place, you might say, is the prior thoughts, the earlier thoughts of those forms. I knew that if I put them in one place or another place or another place, that the place would the relationship of the idea to the space would modify whatever the original idea was. And usually in my case, the original idea is not a fully formed notion. It's something that is probably going to change based on the environment, and that's 2 or 3 environments. The physical one of the place, in this case, I'm going to compare it with that first fully barbed-wire exhibition, which was at the Whitney. And Mac Doty, the curator who theoretically was curating, and I probably frustrated him because he wanted the Lynch fragments. That was what people knew of my work. And they didn't expect things that came from the geometric side of things. I had no bias in relation to art going this way or that way. I already understood that art had gone all kinds of ways in the world. It's just that we were living in a time when we talked about a lot of things. It's like, I don't know, it's like sports. football wasn't in the 1950s what it was in the 1920s, you know. And my father was an athlete, you know. He played music. He wanted me to perhaps be interested in music, but the piano lessons didn't work out. I really wanted a trumpet because that sounded like it would be something, but he knew that music needed the piano because composition and understanding and all that. At the same time, his example for me was linear. It's not barbed wire. It's the wires on a guitar that's laid horizontally, and you put a steel on it, and you move it, and you make sound. I like that part, but I didn't have the facility, frankly. My sense of touch never was the kind that I was going to be a fine musician, you know. But I always liked music. You know, I could make noise, so I'd irritate everybody in the house. Okay. Well, sculpture is kind of like that. You make a lot of noise. You know, people would rather you be doing it somewhere else. Meanwhile, the kind of questions you're asking in relation to responding to a particular space like this. Space is so big. That was my first impression. It was so large. Nobody gave art this kind of space, you know. And I said, well, how much of it can I have? How much of it can I handle? You know, and I said, I can handle all of it, but somebody's got to give me the money to do it, because that's a lot. You know, that's going to take a lot. Well, anyway, I don't know. It's like if a situation comes up, you could say it's 3 dimensions and whatever other dimensions go with it. And some of them have to do with the opportunity of the space. Some have to do with the opportunity of the ambiance of the people I'm working with. And some just have to do with instances that happen. For instance, barbed wire and chain, you know. Well, barbed wire is constructed in a way and sold to you in a circular roll. So it tends to, if you pull some of it off, to be in kind of linear circular drawings, if you will. Well, you can play with that. But at the same time, I'm a city boy from Houston, but I would visit my cousins in the rural area of Baytown, not far away. But there were barbed wire fences all over because they had animals, you know, they had goats and a few cows and stuff. And we go out in the fields just to play, you know. Well, my cousins would laugh at me because they'd say, you're a dumb city boy and you tear your clothes every time you try and cross a barbed wire fence, you know. But it made its mark, I guess, because later on I remembered ideas in there I could use. And the horizontal line of fences of barbed wire, straight lines, is one thing. But when you take barbed wire and get it in a roll and it's circular, you know, well, what's visual art? It's circle or square. It's either straight or, you know, not. And I do have that kind of thinking going on, but I'm not rigid about it. I'm opportunistic, I would say.
Did you, my sense was in the Whitney that was barbed wire that you got yourself, you brought in, and you actually worked yourself. I don't know this, but at Dia, I'm wondering, was this barbed wire sort of ordered and brought in, and then drawn in the galleries by someone else, or were you involved with it with your hands as much with this as you were at the Whitney?
To a certain extent, not as much as at the Whitney, because the Whitney was all me. You know, here, no, they had very good people to, you know, assist and to do things that I needed. I could diagram something for the wall and say, well, every 6 inches, you know, if it's 12 feet from the corner this way and 12 feet that way, and the point is at the bottom, that's going to be an inverted quarter section of a pyramid. And why am I thinking of pyramids? Well, what's the oldest thing you hear about in human history as major architectural stuff are the pyramids. And in 1980, I did go to Egypt to see the pyramids at Saqqara, you know. But the year before, in my own interest and awareness and that kind of thing, we went to Mexico, to Teotihuacan, to see the pyramids in Mexico. Well, these are two totally different cultures which have this geometric awareness. At the same time, if I can be personally, how do you call it? I don't know the word, but anyway, I was the kid, and when it came to mathematics and stuff like that, who did not do well necessarily. It took me 5 semesters to get through the 2 required semesters of algebra. But geometry, I got just like that, you know, so I don't know why that sensibility was that way. Looking back, I would say, well, I always had an interest in forms and structures, you know, and, but at the same time, you know, when you learn about visual art, you always talk about line and form. You know, that's just, you can say line and mass. But linearity, well, it can be very free and loose, or it can be very specific in the sense of geometric dynamics. And I tend to intuitively be interested in those things. But if you ask me where it fit into the world of mathematics or things, I don't know. The word I like that makes me sound a little bit like I know something is relativity. But another version of that is I'm all over the fucking place, you know, and I don't know, you know, but I just think it's all a part of the curiosity. In other words, when I'm doing things, I'm learning, you know. I don't mean that in the rigid sense. It's my curiosity, you know, and a lot of the pieces that I make, I have a curiosity of where is this idea going to take me? What does it look like? When you mention people like Richard Serra, I always, the times I saw his work early on, to be that massive and in an enclosed space, which was where I first saw it down in the village. But then when I would come back from New Jersey, coming into New York, the circular piece after you come out of the Holland Tunnel, I had to drive around it, you know. Well, I did that every week, 2 or 3 times a week. So I was aware of, you know, the dynamics of that piece as a driver going around a circular, you know, form that somebody had put there, you know. And I was not happy that they eventually took it down. I was a part of an arts organization that when his other piece was taken down in New York,
Tilted Arc.
yeah, and he came to talk to different arts groups to get support to keep it there. It didn't work out, but as another artist, you know, I just thought it was great. Well, you get to do your idea, and it'll last as long as it'll last, you know.
Let me ask you. I mean, you're what you say about sort of learning, learning through doing, learning through, you know, what you've done and what you see. It makes me wonder about your experience of doing this installation. And I want to ask you something about geometry, because certainly the what is it? The We Know the Way, which is the first work one enters from the lobby. There's a pyramid, there's a circle, there's a rectangle in there, and so that there's a very kind of pure interest and concentration on geometric forms, and also in creating an awareness of form and geometry. And it's interesting to me what you do with geometry, because I feel like it's such a common word. It's certainly been there through the history of abstract art. You know, it was there with Cézanne and then Mondrian and Malevich and et cetera, and many of the artists at Dia. But it's a term that it's become so familiar that I think it's been largely flattened. So that the idea that geometry can still mean something and mean a lot and have a kind of power or potency, or even a kind of potency to those forms that are very similar to the Lynch fragments, just in a different way, a kind of power that you give them. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that, or even talk about the relationship between the chain on the floor, that circle, which is dynamite to me, and the pyramid in the corner, which is something of an enigma, and the rectangle that one walks through into the room. Like, what is the relationship for you between these three forms? Is it largely an intuitive one? And maybe there's a larger question there about geometry itself and how you think about it and its particular importance for your work.
Well, these three parts are, on the one hand, obvious. On the other hand, they have personal resonance. The chain, of course, first of all, often when people see it immediately, they move to the idea of chains and oppression, you know, that kind of notion. But I've always said, I don't know who's heard me or not, is that, you know, chain is an example of the skill of a blacksmith or a metal worker who can make a different kind of rope, a different kind of string or wire. The chain wasn't invented for slavery, but in the community I come from, you say chains, that notion is apt to show up pretty quick, you know, psychologically. But the reality is, chain is just another form of rope. But it's made, if it's a good chain, made well, it won't break. It will be flexible and can be used for a variety of things, you know. Why the first blacksmith, who knows way back, what reason and what place, who knows? But I actually started using scraps of it and in working with the Lynch fragments, because it gave me parts for the pieces. But I decided, I went to the hardware store and bought 50 feet, a 50-foot length, and brought it back. And my twin daughters were about a year and a half old, and they were out playing nearby. And next thing I looked out, and they had grabbed the chain, and they were pulling around and just playing with it. Nothing to do with anything to do with oppression or anything like that. But what I saw immediately was that, oh, you can draw with it. You know, I don't say that's the first time I thought that, but that focused me on that. Okay, so in the various pieces, often the chain suspends, holds, or moves something in a position, but it also is a variant in the drawing. It's a different kind of line. You know, in the Chano, that's this piece, yeah. And by the way, the title, just to show you my other aspect, that's the word chain, but it's also a sort of personal compliment to a musician, Chano Pozo. Chano Pozo was an incredible percussionist from Cuba, and that music was very important to me in terms of listening, because I was never a good dancer, you know. You know, you didn't Well, as my mother or my sister would say, or my sister said, in fact, in public, it ain't pretty, you know. So, but on the other hand, she very much supported me in, you know, my trying to be an artist, you know, and stuff. But anyway, in this piece, if I say there's three kinds of line, maybe four, and you know the rigid material, the square tube, for the geometric drawing, and yet while it from one direction it's a rectangle, but from the sides it's triangulated, you know, if you will. So it's just different ways of drawing, and I use the word drawing because that's the best word to express the linearity and the kind of presence that's there. But here's an abstract object, you can say, uh, that is suspended, um, an organic abstract object, which is suspended in a triangular geometric structure. And in it, there are probably little ideas that show up in other things. I won't say they come from this, but they both come from the same place within me, you know. With the Lynch fragments here, the first one that's there on the left, and that was the first of the Lynch fragments. And they always show it a little bit tilted down. It's really, that top line is supposed to be horizontal, but it was at one show and one photograph, and it's always at that angle, and it stayed at that angle. And it always seems off to me. You know? But c'est la vie, you know. Uh, but the sharp part that's coming off to the, or visually off its right side, to your pointing to your left, was a little bit of an implication of a sharp weapon. It really was. The title of the piece had to do with an Afro-American community in Florida, I think it was, that had been threatened by the related white community, that if they weren't, if that community, black community did not stop being so aggressive at whatever they were doing, which I can't remember the story exactly, but it was enough that they said, look, if you don't stop it, you know, someday we're coming after you. Well, when that morning came, that community was prepared, and they fought and did whatever, and they preserved themselves.
Do you feel that the that the geometrical forms or the forms in the gallery, because these have you know, there's a narrative element to the Lynch fragments. You know, there are stories embedded in them that move out of them because they're, you know, also very open in how they can go interpretively. And there's also sort of a magical potency that these works have. And so I'm trying to make the connection between the Lynch fragments and the works in the gallery here, because I don't see them as fundamentally different. I see them as fundamentally different ways of thinking about line and space and volume, but it's still very much the work of the same artist. So it's a question too about your experience of these works, if it's possible to talk about that, because you've talked about the kind of, you know, motivation of the work and how you think about the chain and the barbed wire and the different forms coming together. But I'm also interested for you, like when you walk through those galleries, what your own experience of the work is, because there's, you know, they are kind of universal forms. There is so much history embedded in the barbed wire and in the chain, and in those images that it's very open, and at the same time, it's very dense with feeling and history. And I'm wondering what it's like for you to walk through there. And I'm also wondering how those three rooms were connected for you, or if they're three discrete spaces, or if you see them as one installation.
I would say they become one installation. I wouldn't say, I know I didn't conceive all of them together. They were, separately drawn or thought, or, and some of the ideas come from way back and some from that, my response to the space itself. And some of that was what I felt I could do and what I could not do. But given the kind of space, you got floor, you've got a lot of floor, you've got ceiling, you've got walls, drawings that, were quick notes on something no more than 4 or 5 inches. And now I've got 20 feet. I can go this way and 30 feet that way. And what's going to make a significant line there? And how significant do I want the line to be? Well, the barbed wire is a different quality of line than the chain. If I pull the chain so it's straight, or if I let it hang directly with gravity, the closest earlier use of those notions was at Stony Brook, New York, when I did the exhibition with William Williams and Sam Gilliam, et cetera. And they say Frank Bowling curated it.
That was 69, right?
Yeah, 69. Frank did not curate that. He joined us, and I want, but, and I'm going to jump to another gossipy. Frank is Afro-Caribbean and has an English accent. And so people like Lawrence Alloway, also British, they have, I'll say, a bias for the accent, if you know what I mean. The Cheerio rather than the Cheerios from the cereal, different. And I'm saying it that way because Williams and I and Sam and, oh goodness, I forget the fourth man. He dropped out of art very quick, but he was a close friend of William Williams. But Williams was really the person who put us together. I hadn't met Sam Gilliam, and William called me and said there was an exhibition at the Forum Gallery that I should see, and he took me there, and that's how I first saw Sam Gilliam's work. And it was paintings, not the suspended things, but paintings. What I'm getting at with this convergence of spaces is that Sam evolved a different kind of use of space for his canvases eventually. When Frank joined us, his painting changed, and the title X to the fourth power, that really came from me, as if I knew the mathematics of using an X. But by then, for me, the figure X and the political X, that was Malcolm X, all of those were all in the same package to be used differently in any way. It didn't mean that go join Malcolm X. No, that's not why I use it. But here was a person who was in verbal dynamics very convincing for a lot of people. Well, X to the fourth power, what is that? It was 4 people. So, and the 4 people were all different, and everybody brought something to it, And in terms of, what do I call it? How the space here impressed me for the work. I just saw it as the kind of space it was gave me different opportunities. And those opportunities I didn't know in advance. I could only deal with basic ideas that I had, but knowing that when I applied it in this space, I was probably going to have to change dimensions, change implications. I think there was one piece that just is a vertical rectangle, but it's like it could lead you through the wall to another place, to another space. Trying to think, yeah. The quarter section of a pyramid, well, the pyramids, everybody knows, is a very stable structure, wider at the bottom and narrow at the top. But in this kind of drawing, uh, not, there's another one where you say it goes up this way, but there's one where it starts wider at the top and points at the bottom, and those are just variant possibilities, and the the chain, okay, well, we'll take this circle use of the chain. It's a large half circle. But at the same time, there's the circle on the floor that's circular as a mass, you know. Um, and when we tend to think of those things related to modern art, that's one thing. But you go through what's called primitive art or human art, scratched on the walls of caves or in cultures that are not industrial, and they all do geometry. There's not a culture in the world that doesn't use some kind of geometry. And you can see visual examples, but they don't necessarily have museums, galleries, and art historians, that kind of thing. Well, all of that can bounce around in my own imagination, because all human beings think much more than they show. Everybody does a whole lot more thinking than really comes out of themselves into the public world. Well, if you're a visual artist, your intention is to get some of this stuff out. You can't get it all out, but some of your ideas, opportunities come, and you can do it. There's a railroad track unit. Well, you can't be an Afro-American and not have heard of the Underground Railroad, which was not a train, but it was a way of movement. So it's both symbolic, poetic, and, if you will, revolutionary, because you were fighting a system, Okay. But for me, for here, it's a different kind of line. The barbed wire is a kind of line, the rail is a kind of line, the square tube is a kind of line. The pieces, this circle here exists, half circle, if you will, exists in other works that are kinetic. The rockers, the pieces of mine that are kinetic. Well, I understand it both ways, no matter which way I'm doing it. The rocker idea ultimately came originally from a notion of my grandmother's sewing machine process, where it was a mechanical line, wasn't electric. But don't move this one is called, was it cocoa or chain? I forget. But the difference the chain makes here, it's the same drawing as the planar parts. But when you rock it, because of the chain is flexible, the gravity articulates the motion of the rocker in a different way. One of these without chain will have a natural eventual cessation of movement. But the chain, because the gravity lags behind the movement, it affects the action of the rocking. And I understood that pretty quick. But that was the first significant piece that I made doing that. And then the notion of color, And so what if you got a rocker that doesn't rock? Well, there's another piece was there. It was inspired, at least in titling and somewhat in structuring. One was two rockers. One of them which had the ability to rock, and the other part which was stabilized. And it was dedicated to the painter Norman Lewis, because Norman Lewis and I, Norman and I one day were talking, and I probably was running my mouth too much for him. And he said, "Shut up the fuck, you can't hear with your mouth open." You know? And so I made a rocker that, had the capacity to rock. And then one, I got the rectangular unit there. It can't rock, it can't talk, in other words. So it's literally title, but also somewhat inspired by this conversation, which is a kind of conversation you will find in nobody's art history book, till you do it next.
I'm just kind of moved the way the rocker form showed up in this piece. Also, as a kind of lullaby, it seems to me, in that hammock form. But before we open it up to the audience, could I ask you just to explain the titles? There are two titles that don't need explanation, but one of them is called Ganagro, and the other is called Igor. Can you pronounce it? But these are the titles of the pieces in the galleries.
Okay.
Could you just
the first one I didn't.
Ganagro, Gonagro, Gonago. I think I've got that right. Yeah, there it is.
Oh, go in, go and go. Go in and go out. It's it's right there at the entry of the place. So it's
And what
it's
about
like those places it says his or hers, and you know where to go.
and what about the other one there, whose name I can't pronounce? Just before that, yeah.
Iguna Romo. That's the name of a street, very, very important street in art history. And most people in the Western world don't know it. It's the street of the bronze casters in Benin City in Nigeria. When they talk about restitution of bronzes, that's the street where it comes. That's where Chief Omoregbe Ine, he was the chief of the bronze casters, and hereditarily so. I first was there in 1970, and in fact, I had worked it out that his son could come to Rutgers and go to school based on, he would teach bronze casting there, and they'd take care of his education. However, I'm going to use my whole real language. Some American diplomatic asshole refused to give Ine the permission to come to the U.S. to go to school. And he was, it would have been such a, input into American culture to have a person like that from that particular family, which is historic. Anyway, that was roughly the year 1970, 71. Igun Romon is the name of the street. Igun, that refers to metalworking. Igun, Ogun, they call the god of war and metalworking. A thing I didn't know early on in my family, through my mother's father and that family, the Feltons from Alabama, there was an older Uncle Fred Felton who was brought to the United States and sold to the Felton family in slavery. And he was a young adult, but he was already a trained blacksmith before he came to the Americas. And he lived to be about 105 years of age. And in the years he was in slavery, he worked as a metal worker. Like, you know, on a plantation, you fix stuff, you make stuff, and that kind of thing. And what people often don't know is often slaves were, where it was known they had skills, were able to be sold to people who could use those skills. They're famous, I think it's South Carolina, but they're examples of work by Afro-American blacksmiths who probably had some of that training in their backgrounds, you know, and stuff. Anyway, I didn't know about this history in my family. And then the year was 1976, and my mother went to visit my grandfather's brother in Detroit. And he told her the story, and she said, "Oh, that's what my son does." A few years later, I went to Detroit to meet him, and he was probably the age I am now, in his 80s or so. And we laughed and talked about a lot of things, and I guess we got rowdy, and his wife said, "Stop bothering that boy with your, you know, bad information or this kind of stuff." And he said, "No, I want him to understand what we've thought all along about all of these things, you know, that we go through and stuff. And it's important that he knows." And for me, within that is a part of what I'm doing. And keep this on this image, I'll talk about it. That he should know something of the past, that it might be useful in the future. If not to do something, but in his understanding of the world and life and the way things do go or can go, you know. The reason I wanted to hold on to this chain column piece, the color photograph there, it's in St. Louis, Senegal, in West Africa. And I had made it actually to go for another place in Senegal, the Isle of Gorée, which has a large verbal history or actual history of the slave trade and that sort of thing. But that didn't work out. St. Louis, Senegal, which is, I guess, a couple hundred miles north, but an important city. And there was a man who had a cultural organization, gallery, museum, things like that. I asked him, would they accept it and put it in place there? He said they'd be happy to receive it. And in the year, I guess it was 2010, when they officially accepted it and stuff, they made me an honorary citizen of Saint Louis, Senegal.
Seems like a good time to open it up to questions. Are there any questions in the audience, any responses, anything anybody wants to say? Colleen?
That way.
Do you want to? Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm just so interested in how sort of site-specific the work is, and I'm wondering what happens to it after you leave.
The one in Senegal?
No.
The work here.
Oh, this one?
No, that's a
It's
question.
in storage. It's in storage till the next one.
But it's something you can, in principle, you can take out and put back anytime you want, right?
Yes, the works are all in the DIA collection now, and we have worked with Melvin on instructions on how to reinstall them in the future.
There's a question over here.
How did I get to Senegal?
Yeah, why
Airplane?
Senegal was, yeah, the airplane, but,
No,
the,
you mean why?
yeah, did you pick it or they asked you to come? Or had you been traveling through Africa and just decided to
I
go?
started traveling to Africa in the year 1970. The first trip happened because that was sort of in recent American history when they started to emphasize African studies in various universities. Howard University in Washington and the University of Connecticut combined and provided a 6-week trip for teachers to 4 African countries. And I joined that trip, and that got me, you could say, my first on-the-ground trip. But after that, there were a couple of grants that got me there, and then we just decided, you know, to do things to the point where my wife and I, the poet Jane Cortez, decided we should have some land in Africa somewhere. And we were actually focused on Ghana, but that part didn't work out. But the Senegalese painter Suleiman Keita, who was a friend and I'd known for many years, suggested that there was a farm project that he was investing in, and there was another 5 acres available, and it wasn't expensive. And so I joined him in that, and with my 5 acres, we did 2 things. We built a small house, and in the first year's farm production was roughly 2 tons of peanuts. And that's nice and funny enough. But when I tasted them, I realized they were the same peanuts my family grew in East Texas. And, you know, and I knew it from the taste. You know, it was very simple. But within 2 or 3 years, it turned out the land that we had gotten was land that the government's university was taking. And either you take the few dollars they gave you for it, or you didn't get anything. So the house I had built, and there are a couple of photographs of us there and stuff, it went the way as things go. However, an opportunity in the city, because that was about 30 miles out, in the city, another place came available that a lady had started to build for her mother, to bring her mother in from the countryside. And just as she got started, her mother said she didn't care what she built. She wasn't coming to live in Dakar. So the economics was affordable. So I made an agreement, and we built a house there in Dakar. So 24 Sud Foy is my address in Dakar, and there's no land space. So on the roof I weld and make small things, but it's just that kind of family sentiment that, well, we've been away from Africa for 300 years, now we're back, you know. And, you know, we've grown food, we built something, and we have, you know, friends there, you know. I could say that about I couldn't say exactly that, but I see those affinities with people all over the world in all kinds of places. I have been very fortunate. The retrospective of '93 that Michael did significant writing for, that year my work won the grand prize at the Fuji Sankei Biennale. And so that work, which has a Ghanaian title, Asafo Krano, and there are Asafo societies in Ghana. But anyway, it's like the big time Asafo is a way of interpreting it. But it's now at the Utsukushigahara Open Air Museum in Japan. So, you know, the world, if you're fortunate and, you know, can get to go a lot of places, you find empathies for what you have to give to the world, you know. You also find arguments and disagreements. You know, that's, human beings are not going to stop arguing, you know. I just hope we keep surviving, but, you know.
Any other questions?
Hi. You spoke about the importance of drawing upon you spoke about the importance of drawing on history.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was thinking about the works in the show here that are dated 1970/2020 or 2022. And I'm wondering about, well, first of all, I'm wondering if this was the first time those pieces were ever realized off the drawings, or were there other earlier iterations of this work that where you were able to sort of see the physical sort of experience of the pieces realized from the drawings?
Yeah, I would say drawings for me generally are not particular to that they will happen, you know. They're ideas and possibilities. And when a possibility comes and they can be executed, fine. Otherwise, they're just in the piles of drawings scattered here and there, you know, in my possessions. But once I've done a drawing, it makes the idea more permanent in my mind. But usually for me with drawings for related to sculptural ideas, that's what they are. They're ideas and hopes for seeing what it'll be if I get the chance to actually make it larger. And sometimes I just do drawings all over the place and then find that something inside of it is useful for something. The drawing is not always a specific preparation for the creation of a sculpture. You know, I do sculpture, and many things I've made never did one drawing for it, you know. So I don't need to draw to make sculpture, you know, and I don't need to make sculpture to make drawing. Well, people would understand that version, but you know, but at the same time, I happen to do them all, you know, and I just presume all artists are much more complicated than the presentation of them. And this one drawing here, or watercolor, which is the chain curtain idea that I showed in the Whitney.
Kenji, you had, I think you had something in mind about 1970, 2020, the way an idea can sit in the mind after starting in a drawing and then 50 years later pop up. And I was also, you know, just thinking about the difference between 1970 and 2020 and those two moments in American history, because they're the two most fraught moments in my lifetime, but in very different ways. So I'm just interested in how you were connecting those two moments in time, what you were thinking.
Okay, thanks. I mean, I've seen some, like when I look at your work, photo documentation from the show from 1969, I sort of think about like, okay, what was 1969 about at that time politically and what was going on in our history. And then, so that makes me think about those drawings that you made in 1970 and those connections to that moment in time. So that's, I guess, what, Michael, you're kind of getting at. So I guess I was interested in just sort of how those feelings might carry over, or how they kind of translate into works that we experience today. And my other more very specific sort of question is, were the pieces that were created at DIA that have the 1970/2020, were those the first times those sculptures were ever realized from the drawings?
Which specific sculpture?
Excuse me, the ones that are
The rockers or
the ones that, yeah, like for instance,
these?
we know the way 1970/2022. Does that mean that that was the first time that sculpture was ever realized off the drawing?
I wouldn't say they were real. The only reason they had to be realized of a drawing is the people who were helping me install needed drawings here, because the works themselves were responses to the space, but naturally the works ideas come from my whole history of, in other words, I draw on my whole history, not just draw on the drawings, and so, or my own experience of my work. Sometimes I find old drawings and I say, that would be interesting to deal with that. But usually if I do start to deal with it, it's not going to be the same, because first of all, it's a drawing. It's going to be 3 dimensions. And if I've not chosen explicit dimensions and that sort of thing, and even materials, all of those things would alter. So it's not going to ever be exactly the same, but related, yes, And I think, and I guess I'm old enough now to start doing this, is to realize that, well, what you did yesterday and what you did yesterday 40 years ago and what you did yesterday 60 years ago, well, my knee hurts and they're going to transplant the knee because of football 60 years ago. There was no football last year or this year, but they're going to alter my leg and my walking, When I was in the doctor's office and I saw these interesting sculptural examples of knees and that sort of thing, I said, oh yeah, I've done those drawings. I said, and I've also seen the Da Vinci things. And to play with Da Vinci for a minute related to this, most of us know the Leonardo da Vinci figure that the arms are stretched out. And I always interpret it as it's 6 feet from fingertip to fingertip. And so I said, that's a natural way to do things. And I think it's been explained that way in terms of Da Vinci and the people, the way they were mathematically utilizing and developing proportions. So I said, that makes sense if one Lynch fragment is here and one is this distance. That's a significantly appropriate way to see those works. And since it's my work and I'm perfect, I'm 6 feet tall, and 6 feet this way. Of course, during the years, I've been less than 6 feet. All that. You get what I'm getting at is the principles that you use from moment to moment, from time to time, they can be any. All of them are valid. It's just a matter of yourself making a coming together of your own ideas for what you're trying to do at that time. I see that in music. That is, people who are working with music without pre-written music, but they're composing as they work, you know. Doesn't mean the work is not composed, but it's composed in process. And so I can do that in sculpture. I can compose in space, in process, with this material, for the most part steel. But what we didn't say and what these watercolors imply, I really was going to be a painter. And knowing there was no intention, there was no reason for me even to think I would be a sculptor, because I only took sculpture as it was required when I went for 6 months to Los Angeles County Art Institute. You would know as Otis Parsons now. But because I was there on scholarship, because me and football disagreed at USC. So anyway, but what I'm getting at is there they gave me a scholarship to County Art Institute. And a part of my job was to document all the works of sculpture of the sculpture students. It made me look much more at sculpture than I ever had. Otherwise, I had been, and some of the guys in that class were very good sculptors in the sense of here's a model and what they could do with it. And I think mine were okay, but I wasn't thinking of my life going the direction of sculpture. You know, that just happened after somehow I got introduced to welding, and something about constructing things seemed to fit. And I think it also fit into where I was emotionally in the painting. But I don't want to say that's a definite answer. That's just what I think or feel sort of happened, you know. But I did, after a while, feel comfortable trying to express myself with steel and, you know, harder materials and stuff. There are things I haven't done and would like to do, but you can't do everything. But I'd like to do a lot more, you know.
Do we have any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.